Good morning, News Talk 1330 WLBB. Adam Uglum here, hosting the Community Voice program on this January 16th. Today's topic being that it is Martin Luther King Jr. Day. We're going to learn a little bit about Martin Luther King Jr. and one of my favorites, American political thought pieces. Letter from a Birmingham Jail, written by Martin Luther King Jr. while he was serving time in the Birmingham City Jail after being arrested. Now, the letter is very long. I've got it in front of me here, and I've got some highlights that I do want to read, but I surely cannot read the entire letter to you. I think it might take 2 half-hour programs to read you the entire letter. It's very long, probably one of the longest letters in American political thought, with the exception of James Madison, perhaps, to Thomas Jefferson. But anyway, so everybody likes MLK. I don't think there's any kind of partisan divide when it comes to Martin Luther King Jr. He is a well-liked individual, plain and simple. And we have to learn today about why he was so well-liked, and one of the reasons that everybody should like him, and why. I promised I wouldn't get terribly political today, but it's hard to when it's one of the most prominent political pieces in American political thought history. Because Martin Luther King, in particular, with his letter from a Birmingham jail, talks about the difference between moral law and just law. He even mentions divine law when it comes to this letter, and so it does quickly become a political issue, and we'll get to that later. But I do want to read from you first an excerpt from the letter from a Birmingham jail, a piece that I've highlighted from the letter. And Martin Luther King says, "I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their 'Thus saith the Lord' far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to the far corners of the Greco-Roman world, so am I compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my own hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid." In response to his criticism, Martin Luther King was very much criticized for his activism, his impatience, you might call it. And later on in his letter, he actually goes on to say, look, it's been 340 years that we Negroes have been waiting for our constitutional and God-given rights. He even says the nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward gaining political independence, but yet we still creep at a horse and buggy pace toward gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait, but when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen the hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society. It's not the easiest letter to read for the stomach. Written April 16th, 1963, by Martin Luther King Jr. He goes on to say that I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. One of the most famous quotes from Martin Luther King is this letter. And that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. He says we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds. So to a degree here, Martin Luther King Jr. echoes all of the abolitionists. There's not anyone you can particularly point to, but to name a few, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, Abraham Lincoln. In that, and this shouldn't be a surprise, that all of the abolitionists and the civil rights leaders understood that whether it be slavery or unjust law, segregation, all of these things were a poison for the very fabric of American society. They knew that racial tension would be one of the biggest challenges faced in the United States, and it goes all the way back to slavery. So in the letter from a Birmingham jail, the big point I want to get here, and this is something that I find to be a very valuable piece of political knowledge, is in Martin Luther King's discussion of law and what Martin Luther King calls just and unjust laws in his letter. And he makes a very clear distinction. He spends, this letter takes 10 pages of printed paper in, I guess, normal 12 Times New Roman font. It's a very long letter, so he goes into great detail on what just and unjust laws are. In his words, he says this: a just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God, divine law. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with moral law. He makes a distinction that shares close resemblance to the philosophy of the Romans even during their empire, and they made a clear distinction between these two things: lus gentium and lus naturalis. Lus standing for law. Lus gentium is law that is universally practiced. For instance, when someone buys a certain product, one has to pay for it. Stealing is not allowed, nor is murder. In the time of the Romans, however, slavery was universally used and accepted as well. Lus naturalis means natural law or moral law. Certain things could fall under the lus gentium, but not under lus naturalis. The best way of explaining the difference is slavery. Although slavery was universally used in their time, thus it was lus gentium, the Romans themselves considered it in breach with moral law. Dr. Martin Luther King goes further to draw this difference between just and unjust law. And he says, any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. In the Roman Empire, they lived mostly by lus gentium, although they recognized that lus gentium was in breach now and then with lus naturalis. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., however, sees things differently than the Romans did. He wrote in his letter, one has not only a legal, but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. Which is why Martin Luther King had no problems serving his time in the Birmingham jail. It allowed him time to think, to write this very lengthy letter, but it also set the example that civil protest is the way things should be done. You see, there were two men. You had Malcolm X and you had Martin Luther King. Now, if you read their writings, they are both very similar in a few key aspects. They are very similar in that they describe the solution to the problem being self-preservation, self-achievement, self-growth. They certainly did vary a bit in that Malcolm X certainly had a violent tone when it came to how he wanted to solve problems. Malcolm X, on the surface, said he was peaceful, but guns were waiting if peace was not enough, if you read Malcolm X. A law that is an unjust law, as Martin Luther King explains for different reasons, downgrades the individual. It makes a distinction between different groups of people and so forth. Thus, he considered it to be the moral responsibility of people living to ignore any laws that are unjust. I personally agree with all of Martin Luther King's letter. I think many of us, especially my listenership, believe that we all have certain natural rights. In other words, there is a moral law, or even a godly law, if you'd like to call it such. His explanation of what is just and what is unjust are exactly the same as my ideas about just and unjust laws. And I make this argument all the time, and it's because of reading this text that has really taught me this kind of critical way to look at laws. if we think about it on a very simple level, should we have laws that affect some people differently than others? Well, most people are quite quick to say no. And we'll be back after the break to discuss why that becomes an issue. Because it's very simple to say, well, here's a proposition. Should the government be in the place that it makes a law that affects one group of people differently than the others? Is that a just law? Is that a morally okay law that one special group of people get treated any differently under the law than anyone else? And we'll be back after the break and get into the details of that. The show brought to us by Tanner Health System. Adam Uglum here hosting on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, talking about the letter from a Birmingham jail, just and unjust law. Back from the break. The telephone number here is 678-601-8255 if you'd like to call in and have a comment or a question. You can also call after the program, as many of my regular listeners do, beating up the phone lines as soon as I sign off with questions, comments, and things like that. You can also email me at libertariat@gmail.com for comments, concerns, future show topics. I'm very open to doing many things. Don't forget to check out my website, libertariat.wordpress.com. Spelled like it sounds, libertariat.wordpress.com. This show will be available later today there as well. Before we get back to talking about just and unjust law, I do want to read one more excerpt from the letter from a Birmingham jail. With regards to Martin Luther King Jr.'s criticisms for which he received in being impatient with regards to his civil rights protests. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience. You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern, since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954, which outlaws segregation in public schools. At first glance, it may seem rather paradoxical for us consciously to break laws. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine in that an unjust law is no law at all. And here we get back to the point where, who is it who gets to decide which laws are just or unjust? Can we afford such an attitude as lawyers and judges? Should it be so that a judge decides what laws are just and unjust? And would it not be politically and legally perhaps hypocritical if we did not give the same authority to people with a different interpretation of just and unjust, as those are subjective terms? If we have the authority to decide what laws are just and what laws are unjust, and by doing so disobeying certain laws, should people with a different definition have the right to disobey those laws as well? If we would reason like that, would we not be opening the door to perhaps fascists to break laws that they regard as unjust? Does this principle not perhaps pollute the democratic or legal system? And I believe, like Dr. King, that all of us do have these certain unalienable rights, rights that are detracted from moral law or the law of God, the law of nature. But I also believe that citizens also have the duty in a constitutional democratic society to obey the laws of the country. In the Netherlands, for example, when the Germans were invading, constitutional democracy was destroyed. Because this type of democracy was destroyed, I believe that every citizen had the moral responsibility to fight against the Germans in every way they possibly could. In a republic, is the situation different? We all have constitutional rights and or human rights, and our Constitution is as close as we can get to codifying the moral, natural, or godly law. In other words, if a law is unjust, perhaps a judge should declare it so. But the big idea here is, again, that there are just laws and unjust laws. And Martin Luther King served the punishment for an unjust law. He goes on in his letter to say, now what is the difference between the two? How does one determine whether or not a law is just or unjust? To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just, and any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. Segregation, to use the terminology of the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, substitutes an I-it relationship for an I-thou relationship and ends up relegating persons to the status of things. Hence, segregation is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, it is also morally wrong and sinful. Paul Tillich has said that sin is separation. Is not segregation an existential expression of man's tragic separation, his awful estrangement, his terrible sinfulness? Thus it is that I can urge men to obey the 1954 decision of the Supreme Court, for it is morally right, and I urge them to disobey segregation ordinances, for they are morally wrong. He goes on to say, let us consider a more concrete example of just and unjust laws. An unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels a minority group to obey, but does not make binding on itself. This is difference made legal. By the same token, a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow, and that it is willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal. Let me give another explanation. A law is unjust if it is inflicted on a minority that, as a result of being denied the right to vote, had no part in enacting or devising that law. Who can say that the legislature of Alabama, which set up the state's segregation law, was democratically elected? Throughout Alabama, all sorts of devious methods are used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters, and there are some counties in which, even though Negroes constitute a majority of the population, not a single Negro is registered. Can any law enacted under such circumstances be considered democratically structured? Martin Luther goes on to say that sometimes a law is just on its face and unjust in its application. For instance, I have been arrested on a charge of parading without a permit. Now, there is nothing wrong in having an ordinance which requires a permit for a parade, but such an ordinance becomes unjust when it is used to maintain segregation and to deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and protest. We should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything in the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. Even so, I am sure that had I lived in Germany at the time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers. If today I lived in a communist country where certain principles dear to the Christian faith are suppressed, I would openly advocate disobeying that country's anti-religious laws. So should we come to the point where the people, or perhaps I even, should say that the majority decide what laws are just and what laws are unjust? If a citizen disagrees with the existence of a certain law, there are different ways of fighting that law legally. One could hold rallies against its existence. One could file petitions against its existence. One could run for office. The list continues. In other words, in a constitutional republic, are there not enough legal ways of fighting an unjust law? This would be the normal way of checks and balances, but in the time of Martin Luther King Jr., the Supreme Court did not fully fulfill its duties. It did not fulfill its responsibility. The laws, for instance, that were in favor of segregation were clearly unconstitutional and thus unmoral and thus unjust. However, segregation existed for decades and decades. As I've mentioned previously on the program, talking about Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson and how they both point out clearly, both considering Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration and that Abraham Lincoln points back to it. The Constitution makes no mention of color whatsoever. So in theory, any law that had anything to do with color is unconstitutional. From a strict constitutionalist standpoint. Back after the break with more on a letter from Birmingham Jail and just and unjust law. Good morning. We're back. It's 8:54 and 27 seconds on the WLBB News Clock, and we're talking today about Martin Luther King Jr. It is his birthday, and we are celebrating it today, Martin Luther King Jr. Day, this January 16th. And it is well to remind ourselves of his great contributions to American political thought, not only for civil rights, but also for freedom in general when it comes to things like just and unjust laws. And I want you to leave the program today and just think about just and unjust law. Should the government be in the position of discrimination, as it has often in the past? Should we discriminate against anyone based on gender, race, sexuality? Should we discriminate based on income? In which ways is it legally or morally sound to discriminate against a particular group of individuals? Because that is, to me, the key point here. Is it moral to make any law that affects one group of people differently than the next? Is that the role of government? Martin Luther King certainly brings this into question. His letter is a very sober reminder that there is indeed law that transcends itself, and that it, not what some arbitrary judge might say, is the basis of the rule of law in our land. Martin Luther King is a very, very fresh reminder that we point the basis for laws upon which the Constitution was based back to natural or God-given law. From the time of Emperor Nero even, and if you don't recall Emperor Nero, he declared Christianity illegal. All the way up to the days of the American slave trade, the civil rights struggle of the 60s, to our current battles against abortion and euthanasia. Christians have maintained what King maintained, that we must preserve the integrity of the law, even though resisting it when it is unjust, that the rule of law be maintained. As we sit and celebrate King's birthday this year, there are 100 senators sitting in somber judgment in the historic impeachment now underway in Washington. They would do well to quietly reflect on King's great legacy, a deep and abiding commitment to the rule of law and integrity. And something that really needs to be a big role in Washington. Politicians need to echo Martin Luther King and look at just and unjust laws and whether or not it is a proper function of the government to be in the position of discriminating, whether it be for race, color, gender, sexuality, income. And this is an argument you can take with you, that the government should not be in the position of discriminating based on anything. Because discriminatory law is unjust law. It is back to a principle that many people aren't aware of, something I call the tyranny of the majority. Publius James Madison mentions tyranny of the majority being a great threat to the republic. When the majority decide what the minority do in a republic, things begin to get lost. We are all endowed by our Creator with these certain unalienable rights. Among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Is the government in the role of discrimination? Think about it. It's very important. That's the message that Martin Luther King Jr. was giving in his letter from the Birmingham Jail. A 10-page, 12-point font Times New Roman letter, a very long letter. You should take it this evening when you get home from work and read it. You really should. It's a very informative and educational letter from a very, very inspiring, very, very influential man, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Hope you enjoyed the program. National headlines are coming up. This program will be available later today on my website at libertariat.wordpress.com. Please feel free to shoot me an email as well. That is libertariat@gmail.com.